I find the ordinary people around me very, very inspiring. In fact, if you ask me who your role models are, they wouldn't be names like, a Mahatma Gandhi or a Lincoln or a Mandela or a Patel.
You also use the word love and compassion and kindness. What was that instance in your life that led to this shift in your mindset?
As long as you have been at peace with this world and peace with yourself for a major part of your life, I think it's a life well lived.
How do you ensure that any of your biases they don't prick in between?
Bias is a very inherent part of life itself. It's not just
Mm.
humans have biases, animals have biases. Bias has actually helped life survive. So we should not just, think that all kinds of biases are bad. In fact, bias is leading to our intuition.
What's the primary difference between leading a team in an organization which has office only in one country and then leading a team in a global context? Thank you so much, Hari. Such a pleasure having you here.
Thank you. Wonderful being on your podcast series.
Always a pleasure. In fact, the first time that I heard about you and the kind of good work that you're doing was when you wrote this book called From Pony to Unicorn. And since then, I've been looking forward to have you as my guest on this podcast. Such a pleasure having you here.
Thank you once again.
Hari, in fact, that's exactly what I was talking to you about. That, there are very few people that I have come across who have been able to craft such an illustrious careers for themselves. So, having written so many books, being on the board of different organizations, somebody who has been to IIT, today, when you take a pause and reflect, what's your take on that? How would you define a celebrated life, or for that matter, a life well lived?
So, Gaurav, if you had asked me this question somewhere at the beginning of my career, probably I would have given you a more conventional response or an answer. But I think after the age of 50, my views have changed. I have become far less judgmental of things and people. And I have realized that, anyone who's been born in this world has a wonderful story to tell. It just needs that storyteller who can tell the story. I just feel if I had, all the time in this world, I could probably have written a biography of every person on earth. And that would have been an equally interesting one. And therefore, a life well lived is a slightly difficult question to answer because I think the very fact that you're born and have lived on this planet itself is a matter of joy and matter of great fortune that you have taken birth on this planet. So gradually, I have come to the view that as long as you have been at peace with this world and peace with yourself for a major part of your life, I think it's a life well lived. And in terms of a career, I think if people around you have always liked being with you, have respected you, you have liked being around with people, you have respected them in turn, I think that's a reasonably celebrated career itself. If I just look back at my father, when I was in my 30s, I never thought he was a great man. I thought, why wasn't he more ambitious? Why didn't he try to do something more? But after 50, when I look at him, I think his career is highly celebrated. He came through great difficulties, managed to give me some good education despite all the ups and downs in his life. He's 90 years. He continues to read a lot. He continues to be interested in the fundamental principles of science. He reads my daughter's mechanical engineering dissertation papers and research reports with some amazingly deep interest and comments. I just can't but say that his life and career both have been well lived. So
In my early in my career, when I felt that instinct that it was time to make a change or there was something I needed to do something, when I listened to that intuition or that gut feeling, what I now know as my inner voice up here, I made good decisions. When
Hmm.
I didn't listen to it, things went badly.
Yeah.
And so I learned to recognize it because I always talk about I learned a lot by quitting things. And I quit a bunch of jobs that people thought I was crazy for quitting to
Hmm.
move on to the next thing. And when I didn't listen to that feeling or that voice in my head, I was miserable.
Hmm.
And when I listened to it,
real stories to tell, real mistakes they made in life, real success. So I think, yeah, that's my broader view on life in general and career in particular.
Thank you. I think the more and more I'm talking and interacting with people, the more I'm realizing that how there's a story in each one of us. That is one. And second, you said that today you're more accepting and less judgmental of people,
Yes.
provided you also use the word love and compassion and kindness. What was that instance in your life that led to this shift in your mindset, Hari?
Yeah,
What
I don't.
happened
Yeah,
to an ambitious Hari
yeah,
that he chose a path, a different path, where
yes.
the lenses got changed, the perspectives got changed?
I think it is not any specific incident or event that led to this dramatic transformation. I think over the years, as you go through life, as you go through ups and downs, as you see people very closely, I think that's when and as you meet a variety of people, that's when you begin to realize that, there are many ways in which one can lead her or his life. And each way of leading your life, the choices that you make are your choices, and there is no one choice that is superior to the others. There are some people who are quietly doing some amazing work in some villages in India. Somebody who's leading a self-help group of women and helping them lead a dignified life in a village in West Bengal. I think that person's career, it has been amazing in the sense that is it a life well lived? I think absolutely. If I just look at this lady called Tajkira Begum, who I recently met at the IIM Calcutta Innovation Park, I had a chance to listen to her life story. I just begin to think, the illustrious career about of me that you talked about, I don't see illustrious at all when listen to her story. So I think many of these people that you encounter in life are very humbling experiences. So that's when I realized you need to give up, some vague ideas that you had in youth of what
Mm,
constitutes success in life. So it's a series of
mm,
incidents like this, meeting some amazing people who are quietly doing some work, and then they, help you reframe your lens or help you think about, life very differently. You begin to
yeah.
question yourself.
And where you will take a pause and revisit the parameters through which you define success. That's what
Correct.
I was telling my team members a few days back, that what if tomorrow uh, another government comes in and they
Yeah.
change the currency? So from the money in your pocket, the papers of the properties that you have, they become the currency of yesterday, and the new
Mhm.
currencies of kindness and compassion and
Mhm.
empathy, as you spoke
Right.
about. How many rich individuals be there walking on the streets of
Right.
India, right?
Yeah.
So, Hari, since you're talking about career, you worked with giants like Tata Steel,
Yes.
and I'm always been a huge admirer of Tata's in my life. You worked with organizations like Daksh, Virtues, Amba Research, Taxi for Sure, Big Basket, and currently you're running an organization called Artha, School of Entrepreneurship. Just curious, what are those parameters that you considered before making a new career move in your life?
So, Gaurav, I have not been a very calculative person in the sense that my decisions have been fairly quick. In fact, who I got married to, including an important decision like that, was taken very quickly. So I go a lot by my gut. And if I look back, in all those key decisions, the success rate of these decisions has been very high. So I haven't, done a lot of analysis. So broadly, I've looked at a couple of things, which is there an alignment in values, and are there any common interests between the people that I'm going to work with and me? If there is alignment in values and commonality of interest, I have found that other things gradually and quickly fall into place. So I don't spend too much of time getting into deeper analysis, too much of analysis. I've just left my life by some simple parameters, simple rules for decision making. So when it comes to career, it's largely been about identifying the right people, which is, do I have an alignment in values with them? And do we have common interests? I think if these answers to these two were a strong yes, then I think I made the choice. So I've been very careful in the sense I have strong likes and dislikes. So I've been very careful about the kind of people I wouldn't want to work with, irrespective of whatever may be the upsides, financial
Hmm.
upsides or anything. So So I've chosen not to work with people who, I think somewhere I wouldn't want to work with. So I've
Hmm.
just made some very honest choices and based on some simple principles, and they've worked for me
Hmm.
amazingly well.
So I will not dig deeper into who are those kind of people that you would not want to work. I'll not get into that space. But you also spoke about the alignment of values. Tell me,
Yes.
what are the values that you look for that pull you towards others?
Yeah. So the first is, I think I would expect some degree of self-awareness on the part of the individuals, which is that people who can very quickly say, at some point of time, I don't know, or I made a mistake, or I wish I could do this, or have an ability to ask a lot of questions and are open-minded and can listen, can actually give up some positions which they have held and take up new positions based on additional data and evidence that comes up. So very open, to questioning their own beliefs, very open to accepting that they were wrong, very open to listening to others. So I think that's for me a very important value, which is high degree of self-awareness. And the second one, of course, is some degree of intellectual capacity, because that is equally important. Because otherwise, if your intellect is not satisfied every day, somewhere you wouldn't enjoy yourself. So some degree of intellectual horsepower, ability to play brain tennis, I think is equally important. And generally committed to doing the right things irrespective of the consequences. So which is some, I would say, character, which is being able to take decisions which are long term correct, even if they have some detrimental short term impact. So I think I would look for that as well. So, for example, if your top salesperson who's bringing in 30% of your company's revenue is accused by a woman in your company of sexual harassment, what is it that this company would do? Would it soft pedal this because 30% of the revenues depend upon this rock star, or would it take a call of letting this person go because in the long run that's the right thing to do? So decisions like this, what would a company do in situations like this when they need to make that trade-off, when they are forced to make that trade-off? I think those are the things that I will look for,
Yeah.
in people. Those are things that I really value in people.
I love it when you said when you started with self-awareness. I think it's so precious. That's so precious. And at times I wonder, Hari, how can you live a life without awareness?
Hmm.
I mean, how would the life be without awareness?
Hmm.
And something that caught my attention when you spoke about self-awareness or listening, you spoke about asking question, coming from a space of don't know and open-mindedness and intellectual stimulation and committed to do the right things and take decisions. Something that you said is willing to let go of the positions and take on new positions. What do you think? What stops people from letting go of their positions?
Yeah, I think what prevents people from giving up, positions that they've long held and held probably very passionately, is that they are giving up a part of themselves. Because what's our identity? Our identity is the stands that we've taken, our positions that we take in life, some of our beliefs, some of the things that we think are right and wrong. If we are forced to give up some of these positions, we are giving up a large part of our identity. And that's the fear that a lot of people have, which is I'm giving up a large part of identity and I'm getting into a zone where I need to develop a completely different identity. And will I succeed in giving shape to that identity, or will, I fail? So I think there's a big fear. So giving up an identity, giving up what you've held deeply for a very long time is therefore not very easy.
If I were to take a pause and if I were to ask you this question, Hari, who are you without your titles? Who are you if you're not an author? Who are you if you're not an entrepreneur? Who are you if you have not been the chief strategy officer, chief HR officer of different organizations that you have held positions in? Who are you without all that?
I always see myself as without all this, because the moment I see myself defined by the roles that I've played, then I
Hmm.
think I am looking at myself, I'm not doing justice to myself. So if I just look back in terms of, what are my anchors in life, what are the anchors in my career,
Hmm.
which have
Hmm.
worked for me, in my early days and which continue to work for me, those really define who I am. And
Hmm.
I think every individual has a certain set of strengths. It's for that individual to be able to figure out what those strengths are. Most people can go through life without really understanding, what their strengths are and who they are. With some effort, I think I've been able to very carefully and clearly, identify what my strengths are. So for me, for example, I'm an extremely curious person. I ask a lot of questions. I seek answers to a lot of questions. And my width of interest or the breadth of interest is tremendous. I'm, for example, continue to be interested in cosmology, the idea of time and space, how this universe got created, what is the James Webb telescope telling us about the Big Bang and producing evidence that probably the Big Bang did not happen, for instance. I continue to be interested there. I continue to be interested in human capital questions. I continue to be interested in many, many questions. I'm just a very curious kid. That's one element of who I am.
Mm,
The second element of who I am is I'm able to think in a very uncluttered way. Uncluttered way means is very different from being intelligent, because intelligent people can sometimes, identify 10 things that are, creating a problem, or 10 things that are, driving a particular outcome. But there are people who typically cannot differentiate which of those 10 are really more important than the others. And therefore, they end up paying equally important, equal time to all the 10 things. Whereas an
mm,
uncluttered thinker is one who is able to figure out in any situation what are the two things that matter, and is able to pay disproportionate time to those two things that really matter. So over years, I think I've become an extremely uncluttered thinker in any situation. I can see the end game much before the others. I can see it fairly quickly. I can go through those intermediate steps in my mind and figure out how things would look like, how a business model would play out very quickly. The other
mm,
element about who I am is I can spot patterns. I can connect the dots fairly easily. That's me, which is ability to connect the dots, ability to spot patterns. And the last thing is that I'm a good storyteller, which is I'm a good communicator. I've realized that I'm able to bring in a lot of data, facts, emotions, everything, and tell a very interesting story even out of a drab topic. And
mm,
I'm able to do that and explain even very difficult concepts in a manner that people who don't understand that concept, or people who are completely new to that domain, still can very
mm,
easily understand. So I'm able to communicate difficult ideas in a manner that pretty much anybody can understand. So these are
mm,
aspects of me: curiosity, for example, connecting the dots, uncluttered thinking, storytelling. These four things really in some ways define who I am, and have been the anchors of my life, will continue to be the anchors of my life. So, for
mm,
example, all the books that I wrote is largely a reflection of uncluttered thinking and an ability to tell stories.
mm.
And every aspect of working with startups, working with VC funds, is all about being able to cut through the crap and see the
Yeah.
real end state, whether this company is solving a problem or are they
Mm,
solving a real problem, because there's a big difference between the two. So I'm able to do all of this, and over the years I think I've honed a couple of other skills, but those are not necessarily the core of who I am. I've embellished myself with a few other skills, but these
mm.
things were largely
Yeah.
who I am.
Yeah. So being curious, connecting the dots, and that's where you spoke about spotting the pattern, uncluttered way of thinking, and storyteller. And during this journey, right, how do you ensure that any of your biases they don't prick in between? One is having all these four things, the code that you spoke about. Another aspect which is extremely important is making sure that my own biases, my own I know I am. So this I am does not continue to prick and interfere in your way of being. How do you deal with
Yeah.
that?
So I think what bias is a very inherent part of life itself. It's not
Mm,
just humans have biases, animals have biases.
yeah.
And Dannyman, without talking of the word bias, he's brought out this idea beautifully, which is thinking fast and slow, which is
Mm,
that in the wild, all animals can think very quickly, and also there are situations where they can think slowly. I think
yeah.
what humanity has done is that humanity's life has evolved in a direction in which quick thinking is no longer as helpful as slow thinking, because quick thinking, while it delivers results 90% of the time, it can create big harm in 10% of the situations. So for example, take the case of fear. So for example, in the wild, any animal to be able to survive should have a bias that if there is a bush which is shaking, it is being shaken because the lion is moving in the bush and not because of the wind. Because if it is unbiased and tries to investigate as to the reason why a bush is shaking, it is less likely to survive. So it should assume very quickly that there's a lion in the bush and I need to run. So bias has actually helped life survive. So we should not just think that all kinds of biases are bad. In fact, bias is leading to our intuition. Many of the decisions which I told you, which I took very intuitively, is in some way a bias which has worked in my favor. And that bias has been shaped by my own experiences. So a bias which is going to cause harm to society, I think is something that we need to be wary about. So I said, human beings have progressed in a direction where thinking and taking decisions very quickly, where 90% could still be right, but the 10% could create a lot of damage. Those 10% are what we really need to be aware of. So, for example, assuming that the way a person speaks is everything there is to a person, the way a person's body structure is determines, the ability to contribute in an organization. Those kind of biases, which we might laugh at, but all of us carry those biases. When we see an overweight person, automatic bias is this guy is not going to be a good performer. Many people will refuse to accept it, but that's the truth. So these kind of biases, I think you should try and overcome. And very frankly, I suffered from these biases. Anybody could articulate well, I used to always think, has a greater likelihood of doing something good in life. But then, I met a bunch of wonderful people in my life. And that's when you begin to question your biases, which is that they don't fit this standard belief that articulation is an important element of success. I met many entrepreneurs from tier 3, tier 4 towns of India, and their passion, ambition, imagination, and integrity of character was so much that I realized, articulation matters zilch. So I think by meeting people who are very diverse, you begin to question some of your own biases and assumptions.
Thank you. Since you spoke about time and the cosmos and the space theory, we are also talking about biases. We also use the word intuition. My limited understanding is I could be 100% wrong. I'm just bringing it in this melting pot. I don't know where would we go from here. I believe biases come from the past. My limited understanding. Intuition is the byproduct of timelessness. How would you create a distinction between an intuition and biasness? Since you spoke about cosmos and the time-space theory, just curious.
See, I think, the best way to illustrate a point like this is by telling some stories. So I'll tell you one story from my childhood. So I grew up in a small town in Orissa. My father used to work for Hindustan Aeronautics Limited. And in this small town, all of us led our lives, which is I studied in one school, everybody studied in the same school. You met the same people in the marketplace, you played with the same kids everywhere. So, for example, in this small town, the teachers who taught us, they were both men and women. And the women who taught us were all, wives of officers who worked at Tata Steel. At this HAL. Then there were no women engineers on the shop floor at all, not a single. There were some women doctors, and there was a woman who was in the front desk who wore lipstick and makeup and was good looking. So I just told you a bunch of things. So let me tell you how it shaped my own biases. So I felt, for example, that women who wear makeup in a man's world are defective in some way, in the sense that there is a character flaw. I grew up with that unspoken bias somewhere. I grew up with an unspoken bias that it's okay for women to work as school teachers and probably even as doctors, but not as engineers, not on the shop floor. They shouldn't be studying mechanical engineering. So for it, these assumptions took shape over 15, 20 years. And these take shape without you knowing about it. And on top of this, the family backgrounds that you come from, my parents were conservative. So my mother and father probably reinforced some of these beliefs, which is that women who wore makeup are not good characters. For example, they might have reinforced this. Our films reinforce this, right? Our heroines were all women who wore saris and behaved like, whereas the loose women were all Helens, for example. There was a character called Helen. Helen was actually a product of the Indian male bias, actually. She wasn't a person. It was just it represented the male bias about what men thought about women. So all of these begin to shape your imagination. Then I began to watch movies by, where Smita Patil, Shabana Azmi played out wonderful women-centric roles. And that's when some of the biases began to change. A new set of assumptions began to form. So I think you go through your experiences, result in you forming certain assumptions. And the assumptions that you form, you yourself don't know. And gradually a new set of experiences sometimes result in you overthrowing without you knowing some of the old biases and taking on a new set of assumptions. So that's the way I would see it.
Yeah. And they continue to drive our life as well, as you just mentioned, right? Without us being aware of.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, Hari, since we are talking about biases, we are talking about the way we are nurtured in our families. I'm sure this society also continues to contribute to the way we look at biases and revisit our biases. You know, you have worked with the old institutes, giants like Tata Steel, and now you are a part of a very important part of the startup ecosystem.
Mhm.
What were those biases that you picked up from your past that were most difficult for you to unlearn and adapt to this new culture?
Gaurav, I think you know what I told you. One of my strengths was that I'm an extremely curious individual. And
Yeah.
unlearning something has never been very difficult for me. I have never
Mhm.
been able to become tech savvy ever in my life. So I have never been able to understand computer science and computer technologies. But that most other, or most other things,
Mm,
unlearning stuff hasn't been very difficult at all. It's been pretty
mm,
easy for me. So for me,
mm,
that's been my strength. So it's played out, working for in a large company and
mm,
working for fast-paced, high-growth startups, working for startups with different domains in different domains from BPO to consumer internet, working with a bunch of founders who came from different backgrounds and slightly different belief systems and
mm,
what they thought meant by performance and good growth. So I think
mm,
I've been able to very easily adapt. Adapting to new situations has frankly never been a problem with me. I have had, several other flaws in me, and I am hardly a perfect person. But I think this has been one of my strengths: being able to adapt and
mm,
being able to unlearn very quickly, being able to learn new things very quickly. I rapidly learn new cultures, new ways of working. So, for
mm.
example, I joined this company called Taxi for Sure. And I
Yeah.
was at the age of 49, I think, when I joined this company, where the CEO was probably 30 years. Average age of the company was 25. The executive
Wow.
team was, 32, 33 years old. But I
Mm,
fitted in very well because people saw me as, mentally young, and because I was able to adapt elements of culture that
mm.
this young organization had without being critical of those elements. In fact, I found many elements of their culture very, very energizing and inspiring, and I quickly chose to be a part of that. So I think for
Mm.
me, adapting, unlearning, and learning new things has never been a problem.
So help me understand, since we are talking about Taxi for Sure, what are the primary differences have you noticed in the leadership in MNCs and the leadership in the startup world? Any drastic difference that you have noticed in them? Apart from, of course, the average age of a leader in startup is much younger than the average age of a leader in the MNC. Any other difference? Any
Yeah.
their thinking pattern, their traits, curiosity, uncluttered way of thinking, spot pattern, storytelling
Yeah, I
noticed?
think clearly. So, for example, I would say, all of us know this, S curve of innovation, right? Famous S curve. I think
Mm,
large and mature companies fall into the, upper flat zone of the S curve, where things are flattening out, which is innovation is not happening at a breakneck speed.
mm,
Growth is low. They are more or less trying to survive and live through to fight another day and
mm,
preserve their market share instead of growing their market share. Survive rather than grow. All of that, what they're trying to do are some of these, whereas a startup is a company that is disrupting and going through high growth phase. So it is either the left flat end where they're trying to establish product market fit, or the steep in between intermediate zone where they've got a product market fit and are rapidly growing. So I think startups, to my mind, and large companies, the one big difference is startups are continuously transforming organization. They're transforming very rapidly, whereas large companies are pretty much stable. They're at a stage in life where the forces of stability, and those forces of stability have actually defeated the forces of innovation. And as companies become big, I think it's important to have the right balance between these forces of stability and forces of innovation. And once companies become big, the forces of stability, there's an internal battle that the forces of stability begin to win. The bureaucracy begins to win. And I think many of these large companies are operating in that zone where they are struggling to innovate, they are struggling to transform themselves. As a result
mm.
of which, the only way probably they can survive is to acquire, smaller companies through which they can then innovate by giving them a lot of independence, freedom. So, to be very quickly, in summary, I think large companies are at a flat zone in their life journey,
Mm.
struggling to just survive and keep things status quo, whereas startups are in a stage where they're continuously transforming rapidly and trying to establish their place under the sun.
I just love it the way you spoke about the forces of innovation on one side, and on the other side, you spoke about the forces of stability, and there's always a struggle going on.
Yeah.
You also use the word startups are transforming quickly. Help me understand, what does that mean when you're saying transforming quickly? And what aspects of transformation are you talking about here?
Yes. So transformation is on multiple fronts. I'll talk to you about 2 or 3 examples. So, for example, a startup begins with a particular idea and a particular business model.
Yeah.
Very quickly, as it goes to the market, begins to interact with customers, they figure out that this business model will never make them money in the long run. And therefore, they need to make a change in the business model. Every single startup you can think of has made some change or the other in the business model. So, for example, Make My Trip made a significant change in the business model by focusing or defocusing on airline ticketing and focusing more on hotels, for instance. And we can talk endlessly about why they did that.
Yeah.
Daksh, for example, made a few pivots. So I think startups are constantly asking the questions like, are my customers happy? Is my business model relevant? Do I need to tweak my business model? Do I need to make a very significant pivot? So transformation on the business side is happening continuously till they get complete stability. And I mean that the market share is growing and now the plane is in a cruise mode. So transformation is also because your company is rapidly growing, you will need to hire people laterally from outside. You also have internal rock stars who brought this startup to where it is. And there's a melting pot of people who come from outside with different beliefs and backgrounds and cultures, and people who've grown internally and who brought the company to where it is. And there is going to be an inherent conflict between these two forces. Now, how does a startup actually harness this rather than allowing these two forces to actually
differences
break up the
precisely?
company? So that's also a transformation once it comes to the human capital side of things. So everything is going through change. So change is at a very high rate in a startup. That's what I meant for they're continuously transforming the organization structures because they are now operating in one state. They begin to go nationally. They begin to go internationally. They create new lines of business. All of this requires them to revisit their organization structure and figure out whether the current structure is right or do they need to make changes. So structure is going through changes. People are going through changes. The business model is going through changes. Everything is going through a change.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing this aspect. And I just love it when you said that they are going through exponential changes in the organization. And you spoke about structural changes, people changes, business model changes. What do you think, Hari, is the role of a leader when multi-generation individuals are coming together in that melting pot? With that, multidisciplinary ideas are coming in that melting pot. With that, coming ideas and diversity is coming. What is the role of a leader in harnessing the power in that melting pot rather than letting it go in different directions and experiencing the breakdown rather than experiencing the breakthrough?
This actually brings me to the question of, is diversity always good? Or is diversity not desirable in some circumstances? So I would say if you want to progress very rapidly at an early stage, then a bunch of like-minded people can come together, take quick decisions and race ahead. But that to me is not creating a resilient organization that can go through ups and downs. So it can go rapidly ahead, take decisions quickly, but whenever they are going to face roadblocks or challenges, this company could likely collapse. So I think as a company scales, brings in a variety of people, goes to different geographies, different lines of business, I think leaders need to begin to demonstrate the ability to harness dissent and harness a diversity of ideas. And I'm not talking of gender diversity at all here. Gender diversity is not as fundamental as diversity of opinions and ideas.
Precisely.
That's more difficult to handle. So how do leaders harness dissent and harness diversity of opinions and ideas? Many leaders actually struggle to harness dissent because they're used to, people pretty much quickly saying yes to whatever they are saying and endorse and reinforce what they are saying rather than question them. I think good leaders are those who can harness dissent by allowing the right kind of questions to bubble up, creating the atmosphere for these questions to then bubble up and be openly discussed. So to me, that is leadership. That is the kind of leadership is very, very critical, to go through the phase that we talked about, which is, multi-geography expansion, multi-functions, multiple kinds of people, for example, coming in from different backgrounds and yet creating a great company out of this melting pot.
And what kind of traits have you noticed in leaders who have been able to do it really successfully? So, where you said that they've been able to let the bubbles of questions emerge and let it brew in the system, right? Holding the polarities, holding the polarities of ideas, holding the polarities of questions and different perceptions, and yet holding that space, it's not easy. What are the traits that you have noticed in leaders?
That is a question in some way I talked about right at the beginning. You asked me, I've worked for, multiple companies. You named Virtusa to,
Mm,
Daksh to Big Basket. What was common, you asked me? I said, one of the things that was common amongst the leaders of all these companies were that
mm,
they were self-aware and they could quickly say, I am wrong when they were wrong.
uh,
They never felt that it was their blow to their ego. So I think all these people, who can make it are quickly able to say, for example, I don't know, and
mm,
therefore are able to encourage that kind of dissent. They're very easily, they have a lot of respect for good ideas rather than my ideas.
mm,
So a superior idea is more important to me than my idea. If a superior idea is in front of me, I will accept it and co-opt it to be in me and make that
yeah.
my idea. So I will not be hesitant. So good leaders are those who are able to accept good ideas, listen to multiple people, and pick the best and go along.
I think there's one thread which is running common in this entire conversation is, I would say, that's of self-awareness. How aware are you of your own self? Are you aware that you're not getting
Yeah.
stuck with your own identity or position? You also spoke about geography, multi-geographical approaches. Just curious, Hari,
Yes.
what's your take on this? What's the primary difference between leading a team in an organization which has office only in one country and then leading a team in a global context?
Right. So I think, the primary difference is that what constitutes success in
Mm,
one country or one culture can be very different from what constitutes success in a different culture.
mm,
Also, the behaviors that are seen as important for success in one culture could be seen very differently in a different culture. For example, in India, people can come into work as late as 11 o'clock in the morning, and they will hang on in the office and stay around 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock. And, people might consider that way of working as the right way of working. Whereas in a different country, for example, people can
mm,
come in sharp in the office to the office in the morning at 8 o'clock, and as soon as it's 5, the clock turns 5, they're back home, going home, right? So somebody who's used to 11 and then being always available in the office, being always available to call, might think that the 8 to 5 culture is not a good culture. These guys are not deeply committed. So I think that's
mm,
not the right way of seeing it. If you operate in a global context, you will realize that, for example, in Sri Lanka, it's perfectly all right to be soft spoken, and you don't have to be aggressive. Aggression is not necessarily an indicator of ambition and your ability to get things done. You could be extremely soft spoken and you could still get things done in a different culture. So behaviors that are seen as necessary for achieving success in one culture could be very different from those in a different culture. So I think
mm,
once you are leading in a global context, you have to appreciate this fact very quickly. Otherwise,
mm,
people will lose respect for you.
mm,
And you have to be very careful about your choice of words, how you lead people, not make derogatory remarks about any country, about any culture. Very, very important to do that. And evaluate results rather than actions, because actions are not so important in multicultural context. It's the outcomes that should be evaluated and feedback be provided based on outcomes. And to me,
mm,
management 101 principles become far more important in a global context. For
mm,
example, if you're operating in one city, one country, one state, then you could adopt a particular style. And let's say you're a poor listener, and people will
mm,
tolerate you over a period of time. But in a global context, if you're a poor listener, you will get beaten up. People will
mm,
just walk away. So, listening is a very important element of management. But poor listening can sometimes get tolerated in a one country context, but will not be spared in a multi company
mm,
context. So, poor management or bad management is never spared in a multicultural context. Bad management you
mm.
can get away with, it's in a small team, in a small organization in one country, but bad management in a larger context is never acceptable. You will be exposed far more quickly.
Thank you for bringing that. I think listening and self-awareness, as you spoke about, and being curious, I think these are the basic fundamentals of leading a team or managing an organization, be it a startup or if you're working for an MNC, whether you're working in a small city with only one office or you're a part of a MNC where you've got offices in
Yeah.
50 countries. Would it be a fair assumption to make?
Yes.
What do you think, Hari, that having worked with different organizations, which is that one organization that you would give maximum credit to in helping you craft the character that you are today, in helping you become a human being that you are today?
So frankly, Gaurav, it's very difficult to identify
Hmm,
one or two individuals or one or two companies. I think it's a lifetime of experiences that
hmm,
continue to shape you as an individual. And
hmm,
it's not just the lifetime of experience, because two people could go through the same set of experiences and the two could
hmm,
develop very differently. So I think
hmm,
it's not just your own experiences, but the way you deal with those experiences, you learn from those experiences, and you allow the experiences to shape your life's future life.
hmm.
I think that is really what matters. It's not just one or two individuals, one or two companies, or even to some extent their set of experiences. It's how you choose to deal with those experiences and learn from those that really make you who you are.
Thank you. Hari, going back to the core that make you who you are, where you spoke about curiosity and connecting the dots and spotting the pattern and uncluttered way of thinking and storytelling. If you were to recommend to our listeners, because our listeners are primarily C-suite executives and upper middle management team members from the corporate, if you were to give a piece of advice to them that could help them to sharpen these core traits that you spoke about, where would you like to begin from?
So first of all, I'm not fair for me to assume that the traits that I have demonstrated are something that everyone should demonstrate, because each of us come with a different set of strengths.
Hmm,
So it's not fair to say that.
hmm,
Instead, if you ask me if I had to say something, I would say
hmm,
that spend some time in trying to identify who you are as a person. What
hmm,
defines you? What are your real strengths? Spend some time in terms of in and get a deep understanding of that. It's not
hmm.
very easy, I can tell you, because a lot of people would say, managing people is my strength. Marketing is my strength. Such a poor way of putting their own
Yeah,
strength, doing justice to themselves at all.
yeah.
So I think it's important to very carefully
Hmm,
and respectfully for yourself to think about
hmm,
who you are, what's your identity, and then begin to play to those strengths. So I think spend some time in figuring out who you are as a person,
hmm,
what are your strengths, develop some self-awareness, be very easy, acknowledge what you're not good at. So I think
hmm.
that is something that is important.
I think that is the lifetime journey.
Yeah,
This journey, my journey of exploring who am I as an
yeah,
individual started almost like a decade back. And every
yeah,
day, the more I think about, the more I contemplate, the more I ponder, the more I'm being with this question. It creates some kind of disturbance, some kind of pain, some kind of ache, and yet some kind of happiness and joy and peace within. I think it's a lifetime journey.
yeah,
Mm.
sure, absolutely.
Hari, it reminds me of my conversation with a gentleman called Radhanath Swamiji. Now, Radhanath Swamiji is from ISKCON. This was like 2012. And
Hmm.
during that time, his first book came out. He wrote a book called The Journey Home. And in that book, he has spoken and written a lot about knowing who you are, knowing your calling, and operating from that space. You know what? In this book, you have spoken so many times about who you are
Hmm.
and finding your calling and knowing who you are as an individual. I'm like a small baby in my nappies. How
Right.
can I get onto this journey? How can I get to know about my calling? He said, by asking the right question, Gaurav, we have just started this journey. And I
Yeah.
was talking to you. For me, it wasn't like reminiscence going back. And when I
Hmm.
asked that question from Radhanath Swamiji, if not Radhanath Swamiji, we have Hari, one and the same thing. Hari, what are you curious about at this phase of your life? Since you spoke about curiosity, what are you curious about
Yeah.
these days?
At this stage of my life, I want to do things that I'm really good at, and
Hmm,
I want to help people who need the help the most.
hmm,
So, making ordinary people famous, telling their stories, helping them become successful, I think is now in some ways the mission in my life. So, for example, meeting that entrepreneur I told you, Tajkira Begum from Birbhum, a small town in West Bengal, telling her story, listening to her, writing about her, gave me a lot of joy. For example, in the last 7 to 10 years, I think I have met some very, very amazing people, people who are trying to create an impact, people who I have found are pretty much selfless individuals. So knowing about them, helping them in my own little way, telling their stories, making them famous, I think in some ways has been my mission. So for example, I met this amazing young lady by name, Samina Bano. She runs this organization in Lucknow called Right Walk Foundation. She studied at IIM Bangalore, an engineer by background, and worked at Deloitte in the US, gave up a very lucrative career to come back to India and do something for the country. And she's now running this Right Walk Foundation, which actually used the right to education in UP to give education for lakhs of children, underprivileged children in good schools. She used the Right to Education Act and fought against all the forces that came in the way of helping poor children getting admission into good schools. She did that. Now she's using apprenticeship in multiple states to create livelihoods. So if I can be of any help to individuals like these by providing my thought leadership, by my thinking abilities, if I can help accelerate their journeys, I think to me that is fulfillment. So that's what I'm looking for now. That's the only thing probably I'm looking for now.
Thank you, Hari. You know what? As I'm just reflecting on our conversation, where it began from, and the kind of notes that I had before even getting to this conversation, and how this conversation took its own shape, right? It is not about IIT and IIM. It's not about accomplishments. It's not about looking at parameters like the money that you earn and the position that you hold in the corporate arena. It's not about that. It's about who you are, identifying and discovering who you are and what brings joy, what brings peace. How can I be more kind and more loving and compassionate? Hari, thank you so much for being who you are. I think it was an absolute joy, a delight, and a pleasure having you with me here on
Thank you,
this
Gaurav. I
in this
enjoyed this
conversation.
conversation, very authentic conversation, and the questions were amazing.